My name is Claire Whitfield, and 3 days ago, my mother-in-law told an entire room of 200 people that I was not worth the ring on my finger. She said it smiling. She said it in the voice she uses for compliments, the one she uses right before she cuts you. Daniel could have had anyone, she told the table, tapping her champagne glass with one manicured nail, and he chose someone with nothing. A few people laughed the polite laugh people use when they don't know if they're allowed to. My future husband's hand found mine under the table and squeezed it, apologizing without words. I smiled too. I picked up my glass of water and drank from it slowly, so my hands wouldn't shake in front of 200 witnesses. Then I set the glass down, and I said nothing at all. By Monday morning, Margaret Ashworth was standing in my kitchen, the one she'd never once complimented, asking me, in a voice I'd never heard her use before, to please help save her family's company. Before I tell you what happened between that toast and that phone call, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and your local time below. I love knowing where you're listening from, all around the world, at whatever hour you found this. Now let me take you back 4 years, to a small kitchen that smelled like burnt sugar and rosemary, and a woman named Dorothy, who used to tell me something I didn't understand, until the night everything Margaret Ashworth had built came quietly, irreversibly apart. Dorothy Whitfield was my grandmother, and her kitchen smelled like burnt sugar and rosemary all year round, no matter the season, no matter what she was actually cooking. I moved in with her when I was 19, after my parents' divorce turned our old house into a place I felt like I was renting from strangers who happened to share my last name. Dorothy never asked me to explain why I showed up on her porch on a Tuesday afternoon with 2 suitcases and no plan beyond getting through the next hour. She just opened the screen door, looked at my face for exactly 1 second, and said, "Well, you'd better come in before the tea goes cold." Her house was small, narrow hallwayed, with a wood floor that creaked in exactly one spot outside the bathroom, and a radiator that clanked like it was clearing its throat before it warmed up in October. I know these sounds the way other people know their own heartbeat, from memory, without having to think about them. I know the smell of her hand cream, lavender, and something underneath it like old paper, because she kept her recipe cards in a battered tin box that never quite closed all the way, no matter how many times she pressed the lid down. She used to say I had quiet hands. That was her phrase for people who did their thinking before they did their talking. Loud hands break things, she told me once, kneading dough on a floured counter, flour dust catching gold in the late afternoon light coming through the window over the sink. Quiet hands build things. You have quiet hands, Claire. Don't ever let anyone convince you that means you have nothing to say. I didn't understand that then. I thought she meant I was shy. Dorothy had money. Not the kind people announce at parties. She drove a 14-year-old sedan with a dent in the back bumper she refused to fix, and she clipped coupons out of habit, not necessity, but real money, built slowly over 50 years from a small precision manufacturing business she and my grandfather started in a rented garage in their 30s and never once considered selling, not even when brokers came calling with numbers that made my father's eyes widen. She never mentioned figures, she mentioned people, which employees had new babies, whose mother needed a ride to chemotherapy on Thursdays. She ran that business the way she ran her kitchen table, which is to say, like every person at it mattered exactly the same amount. I met Daniel Ashworth the spring I turned 23 at a hospital fundraiser Dorothy dragged me to because she said sitting home alone on a Saturday night was a young woman's way of practicing being old before her time. Daniel was warm in a way that felt unpracticed, unrehearsed, which I'd come to learn was rare in his family. He laughed at his own jokes half a second before anyone else did, like he was continually surprised by himself, and I found that I liked being around someone who hadn't yet learned to perform his own charm. I still like that about him, 4 years later. His mother, Margaret, was a different kind of warm entirely, the kind that comes with a thermostat and a schedule and a very specific expiration date. The first time she shook my hand, at a dinner Daniel arranged with visible nervousness, she held it a beat too long, her eyes moving from my dress to my shoes to the bare fingers of my left hand, and she said, "How refreshing." Daniel usually goes for girls with a bit more presentation. I laughed, because for one terrible naive second, I thought it was meant to be a joke. It wasn't. Over the following 2 years, I watched Margaret Ashworth run her family the exact way she ran the boutique investment firm she'd inherited from her own father, with warmth carefully reserved for people who were currently useful to her, and a particular, practiced coldness held in reserve for anyone she hadn't yet decided whether to keep. She called that process vetting. She used the word about people the same clinical way other people use it about produce at a market, squeezing to check for softness, discarding what didn't meet standard. Dorothy noticed things about Margaret long before I learned to see them myself. She rarely said much about her directly. Dorothy wasn't a woman who spent her limited energy on gossip, but one evening, folding towels at her kitchen table while I sat across from her, doing absolutely nothing useful at all, she said, quietly, almost to the laundry rather than to me, "Some people love what you can do for them, and they call it loving you. Takes most folks a decade to learn the difference between the two. You've got good eyes, Claire. Use them early. Don't wait a decade like everyone else." I didn't understand that either. Not then. I filed it away the way you file away a phrase that sounds important without yet knowing why. There was a warmth in Dorothy's kitchen that I never once found at Margaret's dinner table, with its place cards and its careful seating charts. Arrangements I would later understand were designed with surgical precision to keep certain family members close to power and certain family members politely exiled near the coat closet. Dorothy's house had a chipped blue mug I always reached for without thinking, a hairline crack running down the handle that she refused to throw away because my grandfather had bought it for her in 1974, on their 5th anniversary, from a roadside pottery stand neither of them could remember the name of anymore. Her house had that radiator sound. It had rosemary and burnt sugar hanging in the air like a permanent, comforting fog. It had a woman who looked at me every single day like I already belonged somewhere, no application required. Margaret's house had a temperature, precisely maintained, nothing more. Toward the end of that second year, small things began surfacing that I noticed without fully understanding. Margaret referring to Dorothy's manufacturing company, the one she'd built from a rented garage, not by its actual name, Whitfield Precision, but as that little operation, always delivered with a faint, indulgent smile, the exact smile you'd give a child proudly running a lemonade stand on the sidewalk. She began asking me pointed, oddly specific questions about Dorothy's health that had nothing to do with genuine concern. Is she still driving herself to appointments at her age? Does she keep good records? Do you happen to know? Old-fashioned paper filing, that sort of thing, or has anyone modernized her systems? I didn't know why she was asking, not consciously. I just knew, somewhere underneath conscious thought, that something in the room shifted very slightly whenever Dorothy's name came up around Margaret. The way a kitchen changes when someone has left a window cracked open somewhere you can't quite see, and cold air is finding its way in without a visible source. There was one dinner near the end of that second year when Margaret's brother-in-law, a man named Roger, who worked somewhere in her firm's operations division, made an offhand comment about supply chain exposure and legacy manufacturing partners before Margaret shot him a look sharp enough to end the conversation entirely. I didn't understand the phrase then. I would understand it perfectly, 18 months later, sitting across a desk from a lawyer named Alan Kessler. I want to tell you about one particular Saturday that spring, because I think about it often now. Dorothy took me to the factory floor for the first time, a squat brick building on the edge of town that smelled like machine oil and cut metal, a smell I hadn't expected to find comforting but somehow did, almost instantly. She walked those floors in flat, sensible shoes, stopping at nearly every station to ask a question that had nothing to do with output numbers. She asked a woman named Priya about her son's college applications. She asked an older man near the loading dock whether his knee had healed up from the surgery that winter. Only after all of that did she ask, almost as an afterthought, how the quarter's numbers were shaping up. "You see," she said to me afterward, sitting in her dented sedan in the parking lot, engine idling, "anyone can read a balance sheet. Balance sheets don't tell you anything true. You want to know if a company's healthy, you watch how the owner walks the floor. Does she know the names, or does she know the titles? Titles are what people put on a door when they don't want you to notice they never bothered to learn what's actually behind it." She looked at me sideways, the way she did when she was about to say something she wanted me to remember. "Whoever runs this place after me, better know the names, Claire." Numbers can be managed by anybody, names can't be faked for long. I didn't know, sitting in that idling car at 23 years old, that she was quietly auditioning me for a role I hadn't even known existed yet. I just thought we were spending a Saturday together, the way we always did. Dorothy was diagnosed the November I turned 25, pancreatic. The doctor used the word aggressive, the exact way people use the word unfortunately in a business email, as though the word itself was doing everyone a courtesy by softening what came next. She didn't cry. I did, sitting in my car in the hospital parking lot with the engine off, because I didn't trust myself to drive with my hands shaking the way they were. When I came back inside, red-eyed, Dorothy patted the space beside her hospital bed and said, calm as ever, "Well, I suppose I'll finally get some rest around here." Then she asked me to bring her the battered tin box with the recipe cards from home, because she wanted to write down the rosemary bread recipe properly, for once, before I forget the amounts and take them with me. She lived 4 more months. I moved in fully during the last 6 weeks, sleeping in my old childhood room down the hall, learning the sound of her breathing changing in the night, the exact way I'd once learned the sound of her radiator clanking to life. Margaret visited exactly twice in those 6 weeks. Both times, she arrived in expensive black clothing that seemed, even then, oddly prepared, brought flowers that matched nothing else in the room, stayed for 11 minutes, measured by the kitchen clock on the wall, and asked, on her way back out the second visit, whether Dorothy had gotten her affairs in order. Not how Dorothy was feeling. Not whether she was in pain, or afraid, or wanted company at 3 in the morning when the pain medication wore thin. Her affairs. That's the word they use for everything that used to be love. 3 weeks before Dorothy died, I woke at 2 in the morning to get her water, and on my way down the creaking hallway floor, I heard voices downstairs I was never meant to hear. Margaret's voice, low and businesslike, and Daniel's father, her ex-husband Richard, still financially entangled with her world, the way divorced people sometimes remain tangled in the same accounts and the same ambitions long after the marriage itself has ended. They were standing in my kitchen, or what had become mine, in every way that mattered, except the actual deed. The manufacturing rights alone are worth more than the whole rest of the estate combined, Margaret was saying, in the exact voice she used for board meetings, not for funerals that hadn't happened yet. If there's no updated will on file, everything defaults to the girl and whoever else is named as next of kin. Someone needs to review that filing cabinet in the study before the granddaughter thinks to. Someone needs to review the filing cabinet before the granddaughter thinks to. I stood in the dark hallway, glass of water sweating cold against my palm, and I did not walk in. I did not say a single word. I turned around, climbed the stairs quietly, gave Dorothy her water, sat beside her bed while she slept fitfully, and I did not sleep myself, not for the rest of that night. I want to be honest about what that moment did to me, because I think most people expect anger in a story like this one, and what I actually felt, standing frozen in that hallway, was something quieter and considerably colder than anger. It felt like a door closing somewhere deep inside my chest, not slamming shut violently, just closing, the specific way a door closes when you finally accept that a room isn't safe anymore, and you simply stop expecting it to become safe again. I understood, standing there in the dark with my glass of water, that I was invisible to Margaret Ashworth, not unimportant to her, invisible, a variable inside a calculation she had already quietly finished running. She wasn't planning around me at all. She was planning through me, the exact way you plan around a piece of furniture you fully intend to move later, once it's no longer inconveniently in the way. I decided, standing there that night, without yet knowing how, that I would let her keep believing that about me for as long as it took. Over the following weeks, I began doing small things, quietly, methodically. I made copies of every business filing I could find in Dorothy's study, not stealing anything, just copying, the way you'd back up a photograph you were suddenly afraid of losing, and kept the folder in my car, tucked beneath the spare tire cover, in case anyone ever came looking through what little I actually owned. I started paying closer attention at every remaining family gathering, saying noticeably less, watching considerably more. Margaret, in turn, began speaking more freely around me, the specific way people speak freely in front of someone they've already privately decided doesn't count as a real audience. She once referred to Dorothy's approaching death, before it had even happened yet, as the transition period, not when Dorothy passes away. the transition period, like weather forecasting, like something already scheduled on a calendar somewhere. Dorothy died on a Tuesday morning in March at 4:47 a.m., with my hand wrapped around hers and the radiator clanking once, faintly, almost gently, like it was clearing its throat one final time before going permanently quiet. There is one more person from those final weeks I need to tell you about, because he matters to everything that came after. His name was Walter Briggs, and he had worked the floor at Whitfield Precision for over 30 years, since before my grandfather passed. He came to visit Dorothy twice during that last month, sitting stiffly in the good chair by her bed, twisting his cap in his hands, unable to find the words he clearly wanted to say. On his second visit, as I walked him out to his truck, he stopped on the porch steps and said, almost apologetically, "Your grandmother's the only owner I ever worked for who knew my daughter's name, knew she had asthma, used to ask after her every single week, not just at Christmas." He looked back at the house for a long moment. "Whatever happens to that place, Miss Claire, I hope it stays in hands like hers." I didn't know, standing there on that porch, that Walter would be one of the very first people to shake my hand as the new owner 3 months later, or that he'd be the one to quietly tell me, in my first week running the floor, exactly which of Margaret's associates had already come around asking questions they had no business asking. The funeral was small, exactly the way Dorothy had requested. No place cards, no seating chart, no careful architecture of who sat near whom. Just people who had actually loved her, sitting wherever they pleased, eating casserole someone's neighbor had dropped off. Margaret wore black that looked expensive in the specific way certain fabrics announce their own price, and at the reception afterward, holding a teacup she never once drank from, she remarked to a cousin she had a good, simple life. As though simple were an insult carefully wrapped inside a compliment, the way Margaret wrapped most of what she said to people she considered beneath serious consideration. 6 days after the funeral, a man named Alan Kessler called my cell phone from a number I didn't recognize. I nearly let it go to voicemail. "Ms. Whitfield," he said, his voice unhurried, careful, "my name is Alan Kessler. I had the privilege of serving as your grandmother's attorney for the past 11 years. She instructed me, quite specifically, to reach out to you directly before contacting any other member of the family. Would you have some time to meet with me this week?" I met him 2 days later in a small office that smelled faintly of old paper, not entirely unlike Dorothy's recipe tin. He slid a manila folder across the desk toward me, and resting on top of it was a single index card, written in Dorothy's own handwriting, the same looping, careful handwriting from her recipe cards, unmistakable. It read, "Quiet hands build things. This is yours to build now." Here is what Alan Kessler explained to me, slowly, in plain, unhurried language, while I sat with my hands folded tightly in my lap to keep them from shaking. 11 years earlier, long before I'd ever met Daniel, long before Margaret had ever shaken my hand and commented on my presentation, Dorothy had placed Whitfield Precision, the little operation Margaret so enjoyed smiling about, into an irrevocable trust. Not a will, which could be contested, amended, or dragged through probate court for years. A trust, established a full decade before her diagnosis, deliberately structured so that it could never be contested, altered, or absorbed into any family estate dispute whatsoever, because legally it had never once been part of her personal estate at all. It carried a single named beneficiary, effective immediately upon her death, me. Not because Dorothy loved me more than she loved her own son, my father, who had drifted distant from the family over years of his own choosing, but because she had watched Margaret Ashworth circle her business for over a decade with the patient, calculating attention of someone waiting for a locked door to eventually swing open on its own. And Dorothy had decided, quietly, methodically, without telling a single soul, not even me, that this particular door would never swing open at all, not while she was alive, and not after. "Your grandmother," Alan said, consulting a small notebook, "was extremely specific about one instruction above all others. She said, and I am reading this to you verbatim from my own notes, don't let them know until they've already lost. Let them find out precisely the way I found out what kind of people they truly were, by quietly watching what they do when they believe no one is looking." I sat in that small office for a long while after Alan finished speaking. I want you to sit there with me for a moment too, because this is the part of the story where everything from the years before it clicks quietly into place. the way a key finally turns after years of a stubborn, stuck lock. Whitfield Precision, it turned out, supplied crucial components to 3 separate manufacturers that Margaret's investment firm had spent the previous 2 years quietly acquiring equity stakes in, a fact I understood only later, once Alan patiently walked me through the fuller picture, contract by contract. Margaret hadn't been circling Dorothy's small company out of any lingering family sentiment or nostalgia. She needed it, operationally and financially. Her firm had leveraged itself into 3 interconnected deals that all depended, in different but critical ways, on securing a stable, long-term supply contract with Whitfield Precision, a contract that, without either Dorothy's signature or her legally designated successors, would simply, quietly fail to renew when its term expired that summer. Margaret had no idea any of this had already, irreversibly, been decided 11 years earlier. She was, at that very moment, still telling relatives at family dinners that the paperwork would sort itself out sensibly, once cooler heads prevailed on all sides. She had absolutely no idea the paperwork had already been sorted, permanently, 11 years before she'd even met me. Alan showed me one more document that afternoon, tucked into the back of the folder, a letter Dorothy had written him the same month she established the trust, meant only for his files, not for me, not originally. He hesitated before sliding it across the desk. "She told me I could show you this one day if I judged the timing right," he said. "I think this is that day." In it, Dorothy explained her reasoning in her own words, plainly, without sentiment. She'd watched Margaret's firm quietly expand for years, watched the careful way it absorbed smaller family businesses whenever a founder died or grew too tired to fight, always through the same pattern. A warm gesture immediately after a death, followed by a helpful consulting arrangement, followed within 18 months by a majority stake, then full control. She named 2 other companies in the letter, smaller manufacturers Margaret's firm had acquired that exact way years before I'd ever met Daniel. "I am not interested in becoming a third," Dorothy had written. "I would rather leave my granddaughter a locked door than leave her a key that isn't truly hers to use." 2 days after that meeting, Margaret called a family meeting at her house, ostensibly to discuss next steps for honoring Dorothy's legacy. Though the invitation had gone out to my father, to Daniel's sister Vanessa, and pointedly to a colleague from Margaret's firm, introduced only as someone who handles transitions like this. I sat through 90 minutes of careful language about protecting the family's interests and ensuring continuity. None of it once acknowledging that Dorothy had left specific, deliberate instructions of her own. I said almost nothing. I already knew what none of them in that room yet did. That night, sitting alone in my apartment with my phone resting in my hand, I texted Alan Kessler exactly 2 words, "I'm ready." He texted back almost instantly, "Then let's build." Across town that same night, I pictured Margaret Ashworth settling into sleep inside her large, temperature-controlled house, entirely confident that the grieving, inexperienced granddaughter with the quiet hands would eventually need guidance, would need careful managing, would in time hand over what she didn't yet fully understand she already undeniably owned. She went to sleep that night believing she still had time on her side. She did not have time. She had exactly 3 days left. Alan walked me through everything over the following 2 weeks in the same plain, patient, unhurried voice he'd used from our very first conversation. The trust granted me full, immediate control over the manufacturing rights, effective the moment of Dorothy's death, requiring only the standard filing of a death certificate and a formal successor trustee acknowledgement. Paperwork Alan had already meticulously prepared, sitting ready in a folder, waiting only for my signature. I alone would decide whether to renew any existing supply contracts. I alone would decide which companies Whitfield Precision continued doing business with, and which it quietly, finally, walked away from. "You don't have to decide anything at all about Margaret's firm specifically. Not right away," Alan told me gently, during our second meeting. "You only have to decide what your grandmother genuinely would have wanted, and let the contract terms speak entirely for themselves when the moment comes." He spent nearly an hour that same afternoon, walking me through the mechanics of it, patiently, the way you'd teach someone a language they'd need to speak fluently within days. He explained the difference between the trust's successor trustee filing, which was purely administrative, and the operational decisions that would follow it, which were entirely mine to make on my own timeline. He explained that Margaret's firm had no legal standing to compel a renewal, no matter how the original agreement had been informally understood between her and Dorothy over the years. Understandings aren't contracts, he said. Your grandmother made sure of that a long time ago, deliberately I suspect, for exactly this reason. He had me read every page myself, out loud in places, so that nothing about it would feel like something done to me, rather than something I fully understood and chose. I asked him once, near the end of that session, whether Dorothy had ever doubted that I'd be ready when the moment came. He considered the question for a long moment before answering. She told me, the day she signed the original trust, that she wasn't leaving this to whoever the family happened to be in 11 years. She was leaving it to whoever you'd become by then. She said she'd watched you long enough to place that particular bet with confidence. I didn't have anything to say to that. I just nodded and let him keep walking me through the remaining pages. Margaret made her move exactly the way Dorothy had quietly predicted she eventually would. 2 weeks after the funeral, she invited me to lunch, just the two of us, her treat, at a restaurant with crisp white tablecloths and a maitre d' who greeted her by first name. She was noticeably warmer to me during that lunch than she had been across the entirety of the previous 2 years combined. She asked thoughtfully about my plans, my vision for the company, whether I had given serious thought to bringing on experienced financial guidance for the business side of things going forward, meaning her firm, meaning her hand-picked people, meaning careful control, elegantly dressed up as generous help. She slid a folder across the white tablecloth toward me. Inside was a proposed consulting agreement, drafted formally by her firm's legal department, granting them advisory oversight of the manufacturing company's ongoing supply contracts. I recognized the careful, deliberate language immediately from the copies I'd made in Dorothy's study months earlier. It was, unmistakably, the language of a door being quietly pried open from the outside, one polite clause at a time. I looked at the folder for a long, deliberate moment. Then I closed it gently, smiled the exact way she'd unknowingly taught me to smile without meaning a single word of it, and said, simply, I'll think about it. 2 days after the lunch, Daniel's younger sister Vanessa called me, her voice pitched to sound casual, the way calls that aren't casual always are. Vanessa worked part-time at her mother's firm and had never once, in 2 years, called me simply to talk. Mum mentioned you're still deciding about the consulting thing, she said, after several minutes of unrelated small talk about the wedding. I just think, honestly, as someone who's watched her build things her whole life, you'd be crazy not to take the help. People don't realize how fast a company like that can fall apart without the right guidance. I've seen it happen. She said it kindly. She said it like a favor. It was the same offer, wearing a softer, more sisterly face, and I recognized it instantly for exactly what it was. I told her the same thing I'd told her mother. I'll think about it. She sounded almost disappointed. I hadn't simply agreed on the spot, the way I suspected she'd been asked to make sure I would. That was, without question, the hardest part of the entire ordeal, harder than the folder itself, harder than the carefully worded offer, sitting directly across from a woman who had called me worthless in front of 200 people at my own engagement dinner, and calmly letting her believe, for 3 more excruciating days, that she still had a genuine chance of winning. Daniel noticed something was wrong before anyone else in the family did. He wasn't involved in his mother's business dealings at all. He'd chosen medicine over finance years earlier, partly, I've always suspected, specifically to escape this exact brand of family maneuvering. But he knew me well, and he knew instantly when I was carrying something heavy that I hadn't yet said out loud. One evening, he found me sitting on Dorothy's porch steps, the porch I still visited most weekends without fail, sitting alone in the dark, long after the streetlights had come on. You've been somewhere else, all week, he said quietly, settling down beside me on the worn wooden step, even when you're right here with me. I almost told him everything, right there. I want you to understand exactly how close I came to breaking. I loved him deeply, and I hated, genuinely hated, keeping something this significant hidden from him, and some small, exhausted part of me simply wanted to lay it all out on that porch step and let someone else carry a portion of the weight for a while. But I remembered Dorothy's voice from that evening at her kitchen table, folding towels, saying, "Some people love what you can do for them, and they call it loving you." Daniel wasn't Margaret. I believed that completely, and I still believe it wholeheartedly today. But he was still, in that specific moment, her son, living partly connected to her world, financially and emotionally entangled in ways he hadn't yet fully untangled for himself. Telling him everything meant risking that word would reach her early, however unintentionally, however innocently passed along in an offhand comment. I wasn't ready to gamble on that. Not yet, not with 3 days left on the clock. So instead I told him, "It's just Dorothy. I miss her more than I expected to, some days. Give me a few more days, and I promise I'll tell you everything." That night, once he'd gone back inside, I let myself cry on that porch, quietly, alone, the kind of crying that never once asks anyone else to notice or intervene. I want to be absolutely clear that it wasn't weakness, it was clarity. The specific kind of clarity that only ever arrives after you've finally stopped pretending things are simpler and gentler than they actually are. I cried for Dorothy, and for how much I still missed her ordinary everyday presence. I cried for the 2 full years I'd spent quietly letting Margaret decide, unchallenged, exactly what I was worth. And when I was finally done crying, I wiped my face on my sleeve, went back inside, and slept better that night than I had in over a month. Engagement question. Have you ever had to stay completely silent to protect something important, even when every single part of you desperately wanted to speak up right then and there? Tell me about it in the comments below. I read every one of them, I promise. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button now, because this story is about to turn. 3 days after that lunch, at exactly 11:50 at night, I sat at Dorothy's old kitchen table, my table now, legally, though I hadn't told a single other soul that yet, with my laptop open in front of me and Alan Kessler on a video call, walking me through the final documents together, one very last time. The house was quiet in that particular way. Houses only ever get quiet at midnight, when even the old radiator seemed to somehow know instinctively to stay perfectly silent. Outside, the entire street sat dark and empty. Somewhere across town, I knew with total certainty, Margaret Ashworth was almost certainly already asleep, confident and untroubled, waiting patiently for a phone call in a few days that would simply confirm what she'd long since decided was inevitable. "Once you sign, this is entirely finished," Alan said, his voice calm and steady through the laptop's small speaker. "The trustee acknowledgement gets electronically filed with the court's office at exactly midnight. It becomes fully part of the public record within roughly 24 hours after that. Nothing about the existing supply contracts changes automatically. Not yet. That particular decision stays completely yours whenever you personally feel ready to make it. But the underlying control, formally and legally, becomes entirely yours the very moment you sign your name." I looked over at the battered recipe tin sitting on the kitchen counter, the one with the hairline crack, still holding the index card where Dorothy had carefully written out the rosemary bread recipe, properly for once, in her looping, familiar handwriting. I looked at the chipped blue mug sitting in the drying rack beside the sink, because I still used it every single morning without fail, the way I had for 6 straight years. I signed my name. For a moment after the pen left the page, I didn't feel anything at all. No triumph, no relief, just the strange, hollow quiet that follows a decision you've been carrying so long it became part of your posture. Then, slowly, something did arrive. Not victory, something steadier than that. I thought about Walter on that porch, asking whether Whitfield Precision would stay in hands like Dorothy's. I thought about Priya and her son's college applications, and the man near the loading dock with the bad knee, and every name Dorothy had ever bothered to learn on that factory floor. I realized, sitting there at my own kitchen table at midnight, that the trust hadn't just handed me a company, it had handed me a list of people Dorothy had spent 50 years refusing to let anyone reduce to a line item. That felt heavier and better than any number Alan could have read off a balance sheet. "Congratulations, Ms. Whitfield," Alan said quietly, professionally, in exactly the same steady voice he'd used the very first time we ever spoke on the phone. "Your grandmother would be enormously proud of how you handled every part of this. She told me once, years ago, that she wasn't the least bit worried about you eventually learning to run a business. She said you already knew how to run a kitchen table properly, and that, in her experience, was always the far harder skill to master." I glanced at the small clock in the corner of my laptop screen. 12:03 a.m. I am 25 years old. I am, as of that exact moment, the sole trustee and full controlling owner of a manufacturing company worth considerably more than every single asset Margaret Ashworth had spent the previous 2 years carefully trying to fold into her firm's interconnected deals. And across town, inside her large, quiet, temperature-controlled house, Margaret Ashworth was almost certainly still fast asleep, entirely unaware, still believing that in 3 more days, over another expensive lunch with white tablecloths, she would finally finalize a comfortable advisory agreement with a grieving, inexperienced young woman who had no real idea what she actually possessed. She would find out otherwise in roughly 9 hours. The phone call came at 9:14 the next morning, while I happened to be standing in Margaret's kitchen for what was supposed to be a perfectly casual family breakfast. Was casual in the specific way all of Margaret's gatherings were technically casual, meaning carefully scheduled in advance, meaning deliberately purposeful, down to the last detail. She pulled me gently aside near the coffee station, consulting folder already in hand, the familiar consulting agreement still tucked neatly inside it, an expensive pen already clipped precisely to the front cover. "I know you said you'd take some time to think it over," she said, her tone warm, patient, the exact voice she reserved for people she genuinely believed she still had ample time left to manage carefully. "But I do think it's truly in everyone's best interest that we move forward a bit sooner, rather than later. These particular arrangements tend to get needlessly complicated if we let them sit too long unresolved." I gave her a calm, entirely controlled answer, exactly as I'd rehearsed quietly in my head the night before. I told her I sincerely appreciated the generous offer, that I had given it genuine, careful thought over the past 3 days, and that I had ultimately decided to keep the company's entire advisory structure precisely as my grandmother had originally left it. No outside consultants whatsoever, no advisory oversight from her firm or anyone else's. Business exactly as usual, operating strictly under Dorothy's own original terms, unchanged. Margaret's practiced smile flickered, just barely, just slightly, the way a light flickers for a single second right before a sudden storm knocks the power out completely. But she recovered impressively fast, the way skilled negotiators always do. "That's a lovely little sentiment," she said, her tone cooling by a careful degree. "But sentiment alone doesn't run a supply chain, dear. You'll need real, experienced guidance eventually, whether you realize it yet or not." That was precisely when her phone began ringing in her jacket pocket. I watched her calmly check the screen, frown slightly at a number she apparently recognized right away, and step briskly into the hallway to take the call in private. I didn't follow her. I genuinely didn't need to. I already knew, roughly, exactly what that call was almost certainly about. One of her firm's senior partners, most likely, informing her in real time that the crucial supply contract renewal her entire firm had been quietly counting on had suddenly come under brand new trusteeship, effective as of midnight 3 nights earlier, now fully filed and entirely public record. She came back into the kitchen 4 long minutes later. Her face had changed in a way I had genuinely never once seen before, across 2 full years of knowing her. Not angry exactly, not yet. Something closer to rapid, silent recalculating, like watching someone realize, in real time, right in front of you, that a heavy door they had been confidently leaning their entire weight against for years had never actually been unlocked at all, not even slightly. "You," she said quietly, evenly, "signed something." "My grandmother signed something," I told her, matching her exact even tone. 11 years ago, in fact, long before either of us ever met. I simply showed up, 3 nights ago, for the part where it finally, actually mattered. She looked at me, then the precise way she'd looked at me across that engagement dinner table, when she'd casually told an entire room of 200 people that I had nothing at all to offer her son. She looked at me like I was still that exact same person from that night, someone with nothing, someone who still desperately needed her careful guidance, someone whose entire worth she alone still got to quietly decide. I wasn't that person anymore. I hadn't been for months now, in truth, and she simply hadn't known it yet, not until this exact morning. "How?" she finally asked, quietly, carefully. "Did your grandmother even manage that, 11 years ago, without a single person in this family knowing? The same way you almost managed your plan without a single person outside this family knowing," I said, evenly. "She was just better at it than you were, and she started first." Vanessa, standing near the coffee station with her own mug frozen halfway to her mouth, looked between the two of us, clearly recalculating her own earlier phone call in real time. Daniel's father, Richard, said nothing at all, staring very intently at the fruit bowl on the counter as though it required his full attention. Daniel himself came to stand beside me, not touching me, just present, a quiet kind of solidarity that told me, more than any words could have, that he already understood far more than I'd given him credit for. I did not gloat, not even quietly, not even for a single second. I want to be completely honest with you about that, because gloating was genuinely never once the point of any of this. I picked my coffee back up off the counter, thanked Margaret sincerely for breakfast, and told her gently that I needed to get going for the day. She didn't say another single word after that. For the very first time in 2 entire years, Margaret Ashworth had absolutely nothing left to say to me at all. Dorothy used to say, folding towels at her worn kitchen table, "Quiet hands build things." Don't ever let anyone convince you that means you have nothing to say. I used to believe that simply meant I was shy, that she was gently giving me permission to stay small and quiet, and call it grace, call it modesty. She meant something else entirely, something far larger. She meant that the people who talk the very least in any given room are often, quietly, the ones actually building the exact thing everyone else will eventually be forced to reckon with. And that patience, real patience, isn't the absence of power at all. It's power itself, simply waiting patiently for the precise right moment to become undeniable to everyone in the room. Margaret's firm eventually secured its necessary supply contracts elsewhere at a significantly higher ongoing cost. After several genuinely difficult months of negotiations I had absolutely no part in, and honestly, felt no real need to interfere with at all. She and I are polite to each other now, in the careful, distant, measured way two people are inevitably polite once one of them has finally, completely stopped needing the other person's approval to feel whole. Daniel and I got married that following fall, right in Dorothy's own backyard, under the very same old tree she used to sit beneath every evening with her cup of tea. Alan Kessler attended. He cried, quite openly, considerably more than I did that day. Walter Briggs came too, in a suit I suspect he hadn't worn since his own daughter's graduation, and stood near the back the entire ceremony, like a man guarding something precious. Afterward, he shook my hand, the way he had that very first week on the factory floor, and said only, "She'd have liked this, all of it." I didn't need him to explain who he meant. Vanessa and I are cordial now too, in our own careful way. She apologized once, awkwardly, over coffee, for the phone call, and I let her, because I understood by then that she'd been asked to make it, the same way 100 small requests get asked of people who haven't yet learned it's allowed to say no to family. As for me, I still have the house. I still have the chipped blue mug with the cracked handle, and the battered recipe tin that never quite closes properly, and that one particular spot in the hallway floor that still creaks faithfully outside the bathroom door, exactly the same as always. I run the company myself now, quietly, patiently, the exact same way Dorothy once ran it, by genuinely knowing people's names, their individual stories, what each of them actually needs, not merely what they happen to produce for the bottom line. I think about her every single time I make that rosemary bread from scratch, carefully measuring out the flour the precise way her recipe card instructs, in her own looping, careful, unmistakable handwriting. And I think, standing there in that same familiar kitchen, some inheritances arrive as money. The real one, the one that actually mattered most in the end, was learning exactly when to stay silent, and understanding, finally, that the silence itself was the loudest, truest thing I ever said to anyone. If you've ever had someone else try quietly to decide your worth for you, and you eventually, patiently proved them completely wrong, I genuinely want to hear your story. Tell me all about it in the comments below. And if this particular story moved you even a little, please subscribe. There are many more stories exactly like this one still to come.